Before she was a slave, before she was a name in a ledger, before she was a piece of property, Esperanza de Lima was something far older than any European empire. She was born on the western coast of Angola, beneath a blood-colored moon during what her people called the Night of Masks, a time when the ancestral spirits were said to walk among the living, choosing their instruments of cosmic balance. Her lineage was not one of submission, but of strategy. Her father was a village chief, a masterful strategist who understood that every system of power, whether a small village hierarchy or a burgeoning empire, hides its weakness behind elaborate ceremony and manufactured language. He taught her to watch the performance, not the actor. Her mother was a healer, a woman who didn't just understand roots and stones, but who understood the fragile, rhythmic nature of the human spirit. She taught Esperanza that true power is not exerted, but balanced, and that all things, even immense suffering, will eventually seek equilibrium. They said Esperanza was different from the moment she opened her eyes. She didn't cry in the customary way of infants. She only stared, silently, deeply, as if she was already trying to remember a forgotten mission. By the age of 12, she could recite the entire ancestral lineage of her house backward, a feat meant to confuse and repel malevolent spirits, but which also served as a training exercise in pure, undeniable memory. By 16, she could calm fevers and stop bleeding with a mixture of herbs unknown to the Portuguese doctors of the coast, proving her mastery over the physical world. And by 18, she could read a man's true intent, his fear, his greed, his hidden vulnerabilities, simply by observing the subtle, irregular rhythm of his heartbeat. But none of that esoteric knowledge mattered when the ships came. The lesson you must internalize now is this: the systems of control do not care about your gifts, your lineage, or your potential. They care only about your utility. In 1701, the Portuguese raiders, agents of the burgeoning global machine, burned her village to the ground. They slaughtered her kin and dragged the remaining survivors to the coast for sale. Esperanza watched her father, the strategist, the chief, crucified on a splintered wooden gate for the simple, devastating refusal to kneel. She didn't scream. She didn't weep. She just watched. And in that terrifying stillness, she memorized. She remembered the names of the men who held the torches. She remembered the angle of the sun. She locked away every sensory detail, knowing that true vengeance requires perfect knowledge. On the hellish, 6-week passage aboard the slave ship Santa Maria, she learned the first, core rule of domination, the one that still governs you today. To successfully own a body, you must first systematically break and erase the mind. The traders called it seasoning. Starvation, isolation, sensory control, designed to dismantle identity and replace it with terrified obedience. But Esperanza did something no overseer, no trader, no architect of this new world understood. She let them think she was breaking. She mirrored their expectations perfectly, the bowed head, the trembling obedience, the silence. Inside, she was not collapsing, she was mapping. She was charting their every ritual of control, every command, every humiliation, every fragile fear they relied upon to keep others docile. By the time the ship docked in Charleston, she wasn't a victim anymore. She was a mirror, reflecting back the pure, calculated sickness of empire with perfect, unblinking stillness. The man who bought her that day, Edmund Grayfield, didn't purchase a slave. He purchased his executioner, because Esperanza had already decided, if the gods of men demanded a sacrifice, she would become the flame. The concept of hidden agendas is not a matter of wild speculation, it is the study of operational intent. What was the true operational intent of the Grayfield Council, beyond the mere accumulation of rice and slaves? It was to establish a hereditary, permanent, and morally insulated oligarchy, a kingdom where their children and their children's children would rule without challenge. The hidden agenda was immortality of power. The council's most profound rituals, the oaths, the symbols, the shared secrets, were designed to seal a generational pact, ensuring that their corruption would be passed down as inherited wisdom, not as a moral crime. They were engineering a deep state, a self-perpetuating shadow government that existed outside the official, public-facing laws of the colony. Esperanza's genius lay in her recognizing that their hidden agenda had a critical flaw: it required the absolute submission of the human spirit. For their oligarchy to be immortal, the spirit of resistance had to be rendered extinct. They needed to believe they had successfully eradicated the capacity for strategic, righteous vengeance. Her 15 years of perfect servitude was the ultimate counterintelligence operation, allowing her to confirm the depth of their arrogance and their reliance on this emotional and spiritual victory. When she executed the operation, the true target was the legacy of their power. The total thermal destruction of their bodies and their meeting chamber was a symbolic severing of their generational pact. They were not allowed to have a noble funeral. They were not allowed to have their resting place become a shrine to their oligarchy. The official erasure of the incident was a desperate, failed attempt to salvage the idea of their power, but the structural damage was already done. This is the challenge for the man seeking self-mastery. You must expose and neutralize the hidden agenda that operates in your own life. Every institution you interact with, financial, educational, political, has an operational intent that is masked by its public-facing mission statement. The public mission is the costume, the hidden agenda is the engine. Your job is to read the engine. For example, a modern-day corporation's public mission is to serve the customer. Its hidden agenda is to maximize shareholder value and secure management compensation, regardless of moral or social cost. Once you know the hidden agenda, you can predict its behavior with perfect accuracy. You can see the manipulation coming long before the average man reacts to the symptom. Esperanza's ultimate act was to turn their hidden agenda against them. They wanted permanence, she enforced finitude. They wanted spiritual immunity, she delivered a reckoning of pure, immediate consequence. They wanted a legacy of dominance, she gave them a legacy of ASHE. The Grayfield fire is a blueprint for disrupting any system based on generational, hidden corruption. Identify the core intent, find its self-imposed logical flaw, and execute a strategy that enforces the natural law it attempts to evade. The silence that followed the fire at Grayfield was not an absence of sound, it was the active, oppressive sound of institutional manipulation at work. The governor's immediate order, sealing the archives, censoring the witnesses, rebranding the event as a witchcraft, was a textbook exercise in control. The institution's first priority is always self-preservation, not truth or justice. The truth was an existential threat because it showed the system's vulnerability. To manage this threat, the institution deployed a multi-stage manipulation. Stage 1. Discredit the source. By labeling Esperanza a witch and a demonically possessed, they immediately moved the discourse from a political strategic analysis, she was smart, calculated, and justified, to a superstitious dismissal, she was insane, evil, and an anomaly. This prevented any other enslaved person from identifying with her strategic competence. The message was, her power is not replicable. Stage 2. Control the evidence. The sealed records and the controlled burn of the estate ensured that no one could independently verify the details of the event. The evidence was literally incinerated or locked away, leaving only the official, sanitized record. This ensures that future truth seekers will only find a maze of contradictions and blank pages, leading to frustration and self-doubt. Stage 3. Manufactured amnesia. The total erasure of Esperanza from all public records, the judicial, religious, and economic, was designed to create a gap in the collective memory. They didn't want the next generation to even have the name, let alone the blueprint. This forced the story into the realm of folklore and rumor, which is easy for the official narrative to dismiss. The entire operation, from the governor's first panic to the final ledger entry, is a masterclass in institutional manipulation. They understood that the strongest defense is not to deny the event entirely, but to reframe it. They acknowledged the fire, but they changed the meaning of the fire. Your self-mastery requires you to be permanently skeptical of the officially sanctioned narrative, especially the ones that offer simple, emotionally satisfying answers. Whenever the institution closes a door and says, "Nothing to see here, it was just a witch," you must understand that the most forbidden truth is always behind that door. The Grayfield fire proves that the institution will always sacrifice truth for stability. Its primary function is to maintain its own power structure, and any individual, no matter how powerful, who threatens that structure will be either co-opted or erased. Esperanza could not be co-opted, so she was erased. The only way to counter this manipulation is to become a truth-teller who is immune to the institution's tactics. This means operating outside its need for validation. Esperanza did not need a trial, a headline, or a public declaration of victory. Her victory was internal, spiritual, and physical. She enforced the consequence, and then she walked away, leaving the institution with the impossible task of explaining the truth she left behind. Her silence was the ultimate counterweapon to their manufactured noise. The legend of Esperanza de Lima did not die, it went underground. It became encoded knowledge, passed in whispers between the enslaved people across the Carolinas and eventually throughout the entire South. Her story became a spiritual blueprint for resistance, a powerful reminder that the oppressor's most formidable weapon, silence, could be turned into the greatest shield and the most devastating weapon. The key was not to break the chains, but to master the system of control first. The message was clear: study the architecture of your prison, because it will become the mechanism of your liberation. The men who sealed the records under Governor Johnson's orders believed they were protecting the system. In reality, they were simply creating a forbidden text, a powerful, negative myth that would continually draw in those obsessed with secrets and the truth behind the curtain. The more aggressively they erased her, the more profound the space she left behind became. This is a foundational principle of power: what is ruthlessly suppressed always gains an immense, untraceable power in the shadows. The surviving elite began to develop new layers of psychological control in response to the Grayfield event. Their methods became less about crude violence and more about systematic, internalized manipulation. They amplified religious dogma that preached submission and obedience as virtues. They sponsored laws that criminalized literacy, understanding that the ability to read and record truth was the first step toward self-liberation. They refined the practice of breaking families apart, understanding that the emotional core of the enslaved community was the ultimate source of strength and unity. The Grayfield fire taught them that physical chains were insufficient, they needed to forge mental and spiritual chains. But Esperanza's act had already planted the seed of doubt in their own ranks. The remaining council members, now deeply paranoid, could no longer trust each other. They would spend their meetings looking over their shoulders, terrified that the next servant pouring their wine was the next executioner. The system survived, but its efficiency was permanently crippled by internal fear. The engine of empire was now running on a mix of greed and absolute terror. This is the deeper, more profound truth you must extract from the fire: the destruction of the external threat is only the beginning. True mastery is the ability to turn the enemy's own paranoia and internal contradictions into the final, decisive weapon. Esperanza didn't need a single accomplice in the final act, because her 15 years of observational silence had turned the 14 men into her unwitting, final collaborators. They locked themselves in. They heated the room with their own arrogance. They fueled the fire with their own wealth. The most dangerous force in any closed system is the suppressed truth, and when that truth is finally set free, it incinerates the lies that contained it. The lesson is self-mastery: become the quietest, most observant person in the room, and the secrets of the system will reveal themselves to you. The tale of the fire at Grayfield is an entry point into a far more complex, suppressed truth, the existence of ancient corruption and institutional manipulation that predates the colonial era itself. The Rice Council did not invent their system of control, they merely inherited and adapted it from a much older, darker lineage of power. When Esperanza arrived in Charleston, she wasn't just observing a new system, she was recognizing a familiar pattern: the same ritualistic hierarchy, the same reliance on engineered fear, the same use of language to define and confine. Her father, the African chief and strategist, had already identified this pattern in the early Portuguese and Arab coastal traders. He saw that their commerce was not merely economic, it was a spiritual and psychological operation designed to establish a vertical order of power, separating the civilized from the savage, the owner from the property. This global template for oppression, which moved seamlessly from the trading posts of Lisbon to the sugar fields of the Caribbean and the rice fields of Carolina, was the true enemy. The Rice Council was merely a regional chapter of this global, ancient agenda. Their secretive meetings, the oaths sworn over blood-diluted rum, the symbols carved into the dining table, these were not quaint colonial customs. They were the unmistakable rituals of a deep-state cabal, a self-selecting elite who believed their wealth granted them not just material power, but a spiritual exemption from moral law. They saw themselves as the inheritors of Roman and Byzantine notions of property and dominion, weaving a thread of historical entitlement that stretched back for millennia. That hidden agenda was always the same: total spectrum dominance, the control of wealth, law, and consciousness. They understood that control over the economy, rice and slaves, was useless without control over the mind, religion and law. Their true power resided in their ability to make their victims internalize their own subjugation. When a man believes he deserves his chains, the oppressor no longer needs to guard him. Esperanza, drawing on her own deep, ancestral knowledge of strategy and spiritual balance, saw this immediately. Her 15 years of perfect obedience were her reconnaissance phase. She wasn't merely gathering anecdotal evidence of cruelty, she was compiling the operational manual of the ancient corruption itself. She studied their internal friction, the weaknesses created by their sheer, bottomless greed, and the paranoia that automatically attends any group of men who are aware that their power is illegitimate. The fire, therefore, was not a simple act of revenge. It was a strategic strike against a deeply entrenched institutional flaw. By destroying the 14 most powerful local agents of this ancient, global system, she sent a signal not just to Charleston, but to the entire network: the blueprint is known. The mechanism of your power is now the mechanism of your destruction. This level of forbidden history, the truth that modern corruption is merely the latest iteration of an ancient blueprint, is the knowledge that truly transforms a man. You are not fighting chaos, you are fighting a conscious, organized system. And now you know how to read its script. Let's turn our focus now to the nature of ancient corruption, which is fundamentally a corruption of the soul's integrity, not just the balance sheet. The Rice Council's actions were not random acts of personal evil, they were the execution of ancient, structural mandates. The core mandate of this corruption is the belief that consequence is optional for the elite. This conviction, the belief that they operate beyond the reach of natural or spiritual law, is the foundation of their institutional manipulation. It's what allowed them to commit acts of casual, unconscionable cruelty without any fear of internal psychological damage. They had successfully built an internal belief system that completely insulated them from guilt, empathy, or moral reckoning. This is the definition of a corrupted institution, one that elevates self-interest into a divine or natural law. Esperanza, drawing from her own ancestral knowledge, understood that this belief in optional consequence was their true weakness. Her people had a concept of ASHE, the philosophical power to make things happen, the spiritual law of cause and effect. The council believed their ASHE was stronger, that their God and their wealth had granted them a permanent exemption. Her 15 years of silence were spent gathering the evidence to prove that the law of consequence is universal and cannot be evaded by ceremony, money, or class. The final conflagration was the ultimate demonstration of this universal law. By turning their own resources, their fortress-like house, their valuable furniture, their imported oil, their reliance on the coal furnace, against them, she physically instantiated the principle of consequence. The result was a perfect feedback loop: the source of their power became the source of their destruction. The fire was simply the mechanism that enforced the violated spiritual law. The greatest tool of ancient corruption is to make the subject believe that all systems are random, chaotic, or ultimately unfair. This induces a state of learned helplessness, convincing men that resistance is futile because that's just the way the world is. But the moment you realize that the world operates on predictable, immutable laws, spiritual, psychological, and physical, you gain back your agency. Esperanza's mastery lay in her ability to see the deep structure of the system as a machine, and machines, no matter how vast, have observable weak points. The emotional instability of the men, their infighting, their need for spectacle, their reliance on a single, ritualistic meeting place, these were the exploitable vulnerabilities. She was not fighting human nature, she was fighting institutional structure, and structure is always susceptible to a strategic, focused intervention. The message for the modern man is to stop fighting the symptoms of corruption and start studying the operating system. Look for the points where the powerful show their fear, where their rituals are most rigid, where their unity is most tenuous. Those are the hot spots, the locations where the principle of consequence can be most effectively applied. Your path to self-mastery is to align yourself with the immutable, universal laws of consequence and use that alignment to expose the fragile, self-serving lies of the corrupted elite. The psychological control exerted by the colonial machine was rooted in the suppression of the human being's most fundamental power, a memory. The traders called the act of cultural erasure seasoning, the attempt to break the mind by isolating it and severing its ties to ancestral knowledge. If a man cannot remember where he came from, he cannot articulate where he is going, and he becomes entirely dependent on the oppressor's narrative of his identity. Esperanza, however, was a master of memory. She was born in a culture where ancestral lineages and spiritual knowledge were actively recited, a profound, oral technology for preserving identity and maintaining resilience. Her act of perfect stillness and observation was a continuous, 15-year ritual of memory. She was the one who remembered the names of the torchbearers, the specific words of Grayfield's cruelty, the exact melody of the lullaby sung for stolen children. She understood that memory is the ultimate form of spiritual defense. The system of control at Grayfield was designed to produce amnesia in its victims and arrogance in its masters. For the enslaved, memory was a dangerous liability that could trigger rebellion. For the council, they chose to forget the moral cost of their actions, relying on institutional mechanisms, law, religion, commerce, to keep their consciences clear. Esperanza's operation was designed to shatter both forms of amnesia simultaneously. By humming the lullaby, the song of stolen children, as she sharpened her knives, she was not comforting herself, she was invoking a collective, terrible memory, weaponizing the grief of 1,000 broken families. This quiet, rhythmic sound, barely audible, acted as a deep-level sonic trigger, an anchor of pure, unadulterated suffering. When the house began to remember, the groaning beams, the whispering floors, it was not a ghost, it was the psychological manifestation of her perfectly preserved memory pressing outward onto the environment. The final irony is that the council, in their panicked final moments, were finally forced to remember. Locked in their thermal tomb, their sophisticated defense mechanisms collapsed, and they were left with nothing but the raw, terrifying memory of their own cruelty. The fire became the externalization of their internal moral debt. They didn't die by her hand, they died by the unassimilated, concentrated weight of their own conscience. This is the key to breaking free of any control system. You must refuse to forget. You must become the ultimate archivist of your own life and the history that shaped you. Every lie the system tells you, every casual insult it throws, every unfair law it passes, is data. It must be filed away, analyzed, and synthesized into a comprehensive understanding of the operating system. Your true power is not in your strength or your wealth, it is in your capacity for perfect, unwavering, strategic memory. The man who forgets his history is doomed to participate in the spectacle of his own enslavement. Esperanza de Lima was the anti-amnesia. She proved that memory, when weaponized with strategic intent, is hotter than any coal fire. The frantic pounding against the dining room door reached a desperate crescendo, but it was already too late. Their strength was wasted, their focus fragmented by the sheer, unyielding physics of the structure they had trusted to protect them. They were not fighting a weak door, they were fighting the very arrogance that built it. Esperanza stood back, a detached observer now, watching the final consequence of their chosen worldview unfold. The men, who had systematically reduced all human value to a monetary calculation, were now being reduced to their own base, organic components. She did not need to be physically present in the room to control the narrative of their final moments. She was now the absolute master of their environment and their psychological state. The scent of the lamp oil, permeating the wood grain and mixing with the already heavy, superheated air, delivered the final, crippling blow to their minds. They knew. In that moment, the sterile, bureaucratic phrase in the archives, thermal emulation of uncertain origin, ceased to be a polite euphemism and became a terrifying, visceral prophecy. They understood the engine they had stoked for profit was now to be turned upon them for justice. The roaring of the furnace was now not an inconvenience, but the sound of an immense, inexorable clock counting down their lives. She walked away from the wall, leaving the oiled coal mound unlit for another minute. This was not procrastination, it was strategic. The delay amplified the anticipation, allowing the full weight of their self-betrayal to land. She needed them to understand, in that final, terrible silence, that the fire was merely a tool. The true destruction came from the fact that no one was coming to save them. Not the governor, whose corrupt letters she had handled. Not their wealthy neighbors, whose greedy secrets she had overheard. Not the false god they had invoked to justify their savagery. They were utterly alone, trapped by the unbreakable social contract of their own making, the one that said only the strong survive, and that one's problems were always more important than another's. She picked up the final instrument, a long, thin rod of iron, used for stoking the hottest fires. Its tip glowed a dull, menacing red from proximity to the fire. She did not rush. She took one deep, steady breath, and then she applied the glowing tip to the base of the oiled coal and kindling pile. The first moment was a hiss, a sound of profound release. Then, the fire caught, quickly, voraciously, an eruption of pure, blinding light that immediately began to devour the coal stack. The fire was no longer a symbol, it was the mechanism of a just, final consequence. The heat was instantly unbearable, a physical manifestation of the immense psychological pressure she had been building for 15 years. She turned her back to the blaze, ignoring the sounds that were now beginning to leak through the wall, not words, but the terrible, high-pitched sounds of men being unmade. She returned to the front of the furnace, the iron beast that had been the silent witness to every act of cruelty at Grayfield. She pulled a stool close and sat down, her hands folded in her lap, exactly as the sheriff's men would find her 3 days later. The lullaby began again, this time not a countdown, but a quiet, powerful song of closure. She was not a judge, she was a medium, the instrument through which the universe was rebalancing its immense, broken scales. The Grayfield massacre, as history would later try to forget it, was not about fire. It was about perfect, asymmetrical psychological warfare waged against an untouchable elite, a masterclass in turning a system's own strengths into its inescapable trap. The mythic scale of the Grayfield fire is rooted in the strategic use of ancient corruption as a self-consuming fuel. The corruption was not just in their hearts, it was in the very ground they walked on, the timber of their house, and the gold in their pockets. The Rice Council's system was built on a foundation of stolen labor and stolen land, a double theft that incurred a massive, compound spiritual debt. This ancient corruption, the original, foundational crime, is what Esperanza weaponized. Her process of sowing discord among the council members was a strategic move to initiate the internal combustion of the corrupted entity. By highlighting their individual greed and suspicion, she caused the spiritual debt to come due internally first. The paranoia, the infighting, the betrayal, these were the initial, non-physical signs of the structure collapsing under the weight of its own moral bankruptcy. The final physical fire was merely the outward, spectacular manifestation of the inner, spiritual collapse. The sheer intensity of the blaze, the fact that it defied a simple house fire and consumed the men to unrecognizability, is the mythic confirmation that this was a reckoning, a discharge of historical debt, not a simple murder. The energy for the fire came not from the coal, but from the spiritual mass of the accumulated corruption. The lesson here for the man seeking elite knowledge is to understand the energetic cost of corruption. Every institution, every financial system, and every man who operates outside of universal law is building up a spiritual debt. This debt is not abstract, it is a structural flaw that will eventually manifest as a point of crisis, failure, or collapse. Your advantage lies in recognizing where this debt is highest. The places of greatest historical oppression, the systems that promise the greatest reward for the least moral sacrifice, the institutions that rely on the most aggressive forms of denial, these are the systems that are most structurally unsound. Do not be intimidated by the outward appearance of strength. The Rice Council appeared unshakable, but their power was brittle, reliant on a network of lies. The moment one single individual refused to participate in the lie and aligned herself with the universal law of consequence, the entire structure became vulnerable. Esperanza de Lima was a living conduit for the law of consequence. She simply brought the full weight of the ancient, forgotten, spiritual debt to bear on the physical architects of the system. The Grayfield fire is a powerful reminder that there are laws that even the most powerful men cannot repeal. Your self-mastery is found in your unwavering, strategic alignment with those immutable, universal laws. The terrifying command of Esperanza's voice, a darker, more commanding presence than mere fear, stems from her total spiritual non-negotiability. She had passed the point where her freedom, her life, or her safety was subject to negotiation with the system. Her purpose was singular, her vow unbreakable. This is the source of all true, power-based authority. The men in the dining room were still operating in a world of negotiation. They would have pleaded, offered wealth, promised freedom, anything to strike a deal and maintain their physical existence. Their minds were still in the transactional, corrupt framework that had defined their lives. Their voice was the voice of compromise. Esperanza's voice, even in its silence, was the voice of consequence. It contained no threat, no plea, and no room for compromise. It was a statement of an action already completed in the spiritual and strategic realm, simply awaiting its physical manifestation. When she spoke the phrase about justice and coal, it was not a warning, it was a final, cold confirmation of a universal equation. This difference, the voice of compromise versus the voice of consequence, is the key strategic distinction for the man who seeks to influence and master his environment. If your voice is rooted in compromise, you are always offering to trade value for an outcome. You are operating from a place of perceived lack, and the system can easily manipulate you by controlling the flow of that value. If your voice is rooted in consequence, you are speaking from a place of absolute, self-contained abundance. You are not trading, you are simply stating the inevitable outcome of a set of actions. This voice cannot be bought, manipulated, or intimidated, because it is entirely self-sovereign. Esperanza's training ground was the 15 years of perfect stillness, where she stripped away all need for external validation or immediate relief. She was willing to endure the cost to herself to enforce the law. This is the ultimate, forbidden knowledge of power. True authority is inseparable from the willingness to suffer the consequence of your own actions for the sake of a higher principle. The men of the council were unwilling to suffer any consequence. That is why their voice was broken. Esperanza was willing to suffer all consequences, which is why her voice, even in a single phrase, was utterly commanding and indelible. Your self-mastery is complete when you can look at the chaos of the world and speak only the language of consequence, knowing that your internal alignment with truth is the ultimate, unbreakable power. The meeting dissolved into ragged, ugly fragments. One man argued about a 3-year-old tax dispute. Another muttered incoherently about God's imminent, terrible punishment. 2 more whispered near the window, their words too sharp and venomous for courtesy, their camaraderie having utterly failed them. The ornate candles guttered aggressively, though no wind stirred through the sealed house. A bead of expensive wax slid down a brass holder, pooling on the wooden base like a fresh drop of blood. Esperanza refilled glasses no one asked for. She moved slowly now, deliberately giving the room all the time it needed to entirely unravel itself. Every sound now carried immense weight, the nervous scrape of a chair, the loud, insistent tick of the standing clock, and the furnace sighing, breathing its hot breath up through the floorboards. The men tried to speak over those sounds, to reassert their collective authority with their words, but the rhythmic, terrifying pulse of the house was louder than any one of them. Grayfield suddenly struck the table with a desperate, jarring bang of his fist. "Enough," he shouted, his voice momentarily regaining its old command. "We are not children frightened by superstition. This estate stands on reason, not ghosts." He was looking directly at her when he said it, a final, futile attempt to exert control over the source of the unease. She met his eyes for the first time in 15 years. Not with defiance. Not even with anger. Just with perfect, blank recognition. "Of course, sir," she said, her voice a soft, low sound that nevertheless cut through the ringing silence. "Reason built this place." The words were simple, but something in them, the sheer, unadorned truth of the statement, made the entire room fall utterly still. A few of the men shifted, leaning forward, as though expecting her to deliver a curse or a grand, dramatic speech. None came. Esperanza simply turned away, and in that simple, calculated movement, she let silence do the rest of the devastating work. Because silence, she knew from long, bitter experience, was the oldest and most devastating instrument of power. The very same tool they had used for generations to keep others voiceless could, when turned around, unmake them completely. The clock ticked on. The air grew unbearably hotter. Sweat beaded instantly at the collars of their fine coats. Someone cursed the heat with a raw, panicked edge to his voice, but no one rose to open a window. No one dared to move first. Esperanza stood near the doorway, the hum of her ancient lullaby now barely audible, just a delicate, chilling thread of sound weaving through the unbearable tension. It was not magic. It was not an active curse. It was memory, the total, unassimilated memory of suffering, returning to completely fill the room. Every raw echo of agony the walls had absorbed for over a decade now pressed outward, physically reshaping the air, making it difficult to breathe, impossible to think. She didn't have to do anything more. The house itself was remembering. By dusk, the Great Rice Council's final meeting had become a vigil of utter, paralyzing silence, 14 men surrounded by the crushing weight of their own history, and one woman standing among them, unseen no longer. At first, it was only a feeling, a subtle, atmospheric shift. The overseers began to talk about the air in the house, how it felt profoundly heavy, how the massive coal furnace in the kitchen annex never seemed to fully cool, even in the dead of summer. The hunting dogs started barking relentlessly at empty corners of the yard, their hackles raised in fear of a ghost only they could scent. Lamps sputtered for no discernible reason, and the imported glass windows began sweating with a cold, black soot that defied any cleaning effort. Esperanza never spoke of any of it. She maintained her perfect, quiet rhythm: cook, serve, clean, disappear. But she began to change tiny, imperceptible things. The placement of the salt cellar on the table. The specific, non-sequential order of the dinner courses. The near-silent sound of her footsteps on the main staircase. She understood, with a deep, intuitive mastery, that haunting begins with a psychological misdirection. When the rational mind can no longer find its expected pattern, when the comfortable, predictable rhythms of its controlled world are disrupted, it is forced to invent a new one, and that invention is always fear. Within weeks, the Rice Council began to meet less often. Some members claimed sudden, debilitating illness. Others reported prolonged stretches of catastrophic bad luck, a major shipment lost at sea, a wife miscarrying a vital heir, a fever that refused to break in their main workforce. The men blamed the weather, they blamed Providence, they blamed the soil, they blamed anyone and anything but themselves. Esperanza watched their collective certainty drain away, cup by measured cup. At night, she walked the dark, oppressive corridors of Grayfield, but she was not walking alone. She was listening. The house itself had begun to talk back to its inhabitants. The ancient, heavy support beams groaned like wounded men. The floorboards whispered underfoot. And the furnace, the great iron beast of the engine room, breathed a slow, metallic sigh. She learned its voice, the low, steady rhythm of coal collapsing into pure ash. She timed her own breathing to it, until she could feel the pulse of heat behind the kitchen walls like a second, defiant heart. She began to leave small, untraceable messages. A faint, almost invisible mark on the ledger of accounts. A chilling phrase in Portuguese carved beneath the dining table in the grain of the wood. A single, cold piece of coal deliberately left on top of a letter from the governor. Nothing large enough to definitively accuse anyone of an actionable crime or witchcraft, but just enough to make the men look at one another differently, to make them wonder who among their trusted circle had finally broken faith. What they never realized was that Esperanza didn't need to curse them. All she had to do was systematically allow their own vast, accumulated guilt to do the relentless, slow work of unmaking them. By the early spring of 1716, Grayfield was no longer a unified estate, it was a house profoundly divided. The furnace burned hotter. The imported wine soured quicker. The air itself seemed to thicken with palpable unease and accusation. The council that once spoke with one powerful voice now argued in tense, desperate whispers. Esperanza served their meals as always, eyes lowered, voice quiet. Yet, in her perfect silence, there was the faintest, most chilling trace of a smile. Because the ghosts they feared were not outside the walls. They were inside, already resident within every one of them, and she had simply taught them, finally, how to listen. In early June of 1716, Edmund Grayfield dispatched his usual invitations. These were hand-inked, sealed letters bearing the weighty emblem of the Rice Council, a sheath of grain encircling a powerful, gold-stamped crown. The words were the required routine, quarterly meeting, Grayfield Estate, June 23rd. Attendance is required. But this time, the letters felt different. Several of the men hesitated to reply. One had just lost a son to a sudden, inexplicable fever. Another complained of a swiftly spreading sickness among his most profitable workers. Yet each one knew the ironclad rule of their system: to miss a council meeting was to invite immediate, crippling suspicion. The machine they had painstakingly built ran on trust and fear in absolute equal measure, and neither commodity could afford to falter without threatening the entire structure. Esperanza watched Grayfield dictating those letters to his personal secretary. She polished the heavy brass seal, heated the wax until it flowed like blood, and personally carried the messages to the courier. She never altered a single word. She didn't need to. Every invitation, in the context of their mounting paranoia, was already a summons to an inevitable judgment. In the weeks leading up to the meeting, she began her final, meticulous preparation of the house. The kitchen annex gleamed. The dining room floors shone like black glass. To the remaining overseers and servants, it looked like an act of flawless, dedicated devotion. In truth, it was camouflage, the perfect disguise for her final operation. Each measured stroke of her hand, each hour spent cleaning, was a means of measuring distance, timing, the placement of doors, and the satisfying, structural weight of the main keys. She mapped the entire estate like a battlefield: the light angles, the sound echoes, the deepest, most useful shadows. At night, she listened through the thin cracks of the inner walls as Grayfield spoke to himself. His voice had changed profoundly. Less command, more worry. He had started reading complex scripture aloud, as if the words themselves possessed the power to form a protective shield against the growing darkness. Esperanza learned the verses, too, silently repeating each line until the holy words twisted, turning his desperate, murmured prayers into her own dark, chilling prophecies. The day before the council arrived, she stood alone in the vast, stifling kitchen beside the enormous, coal-fed furnace. The metal skin of the structure glowed a dull, menacing red, breathing palpable heat through the stone floor. She deliberately placed her palm against it and felt the vibration, not of anger or passion, but of inevitable, cold-blooded necessity. Everything she had witnessed, every unconscionable cruelty she had endured, every single memory of suffering had converged on this one, single, powerful pulse of heat. When the fateful day dawned, the estate stirred like a cornered, terrified animal sensing an incoming storm. Carriages rolled heavily up the main drive, their wheels cutting deep channels through the mud. Horses shuddered under the sheer weight of powdered men in silk lace and unforgivable arrogance. Esperanza opened the grand doors for each of them, her eye steady, her voice perfectly even. None of them noticed the one, crucial thing: she no longer looked afraid. That afternoon, the Rice Council would meet for the final, irreversible time. Let's address the final, ultimate psychological control system the elite attempt to enforce: the belief in chaos and meaninglessness. The Council's system was designed to convince its victims that their suffering was random, arbitrary, and without ultimate purpose, a brutal, meaningless fact of existence. This strips the victim of hope and strategic intent. Esperanza's entire life was the rejection of this premise. She saw the Grayfield system not as chaos, but as a rigid, ritualistic, and therefore predictable machine. Her vengeance was the ultimate act of imposing meaning and order onto a system that had tried to mandate meaninglessness. The fire was an act of profound, strategic re-signification. She took an instrument of their power, the coal furnace, the symbol of their wealth-producing engine, and turned it into the altar of their judgment. She took a moment of arbitrary, unpunished violence, Sarah's murder, and made it the precise, final reason for the structured, unavoidable death of the entire council. She turned the chaos of oppression into the inevitable, beautiful order of consequence. The mythic power of the Grayfield fire is that it establishes an undeniable cosmic ledger. It proves that the moral and spiritual debts incurred by the corrupt elite are tracked, filed, and eventually reconciled with a terrifying precision. The terror for the surviving elite was not the fire itself, but the undeniable meaning of the fire. It was proof that an external, higher law was watching, waiting, and could be enforced by the most invisible among them. For the awakened man, this is the final, essential lesson of Esperanza de Lima. You must reject the institutional lie of chaos. The world is not random. The structures of manipulation and corruption operate on predictable, self-serving laws. Your power is to study these laws and to align yourself with the immutable laws of consequence, balance, and truth. Do not look for external justice, enforce the law of consequence yourself through precise, strategic action. Your commitment to self-mastery is your commitment to imposing meaning and order onto the chaos of the corrupted world. Every act of calculated self-improvement, every moment of disciplined stillness, every acquisition of forbidden knowledge is an entry in the cosmic ledger, a strategic move against the forces of meaninglessness. The man who has meaning can never be controlled. The forbidden nature of Esperanza's knowledge rests in its total rejection of the established power structure's central lie, the illusion of invincibility. The elite believe their systems are too vast, too complex, and too deeply rooted to ever be fundamentally threatened. Her act proved this invincibility is a psychological construct, an elaborate piece of theater. The true, deep threat of the Grayfield incident was that it presented a scalable, repeatable blueprint for disruption. The blueprint is not as burn the house down. The blueprint is immerse and disappear, achieve perfect invisibility within the system by mastering the expected role, the silence. Strategic reconnaissance, chart the emotional, ritualistic, and structural flaws of the elite, the 15 years of observation. Weaponize internal flaw, turn the enemy's own paranoia, greed, and structural rigidity into the primary mechanism of their downfall, the sowing of discord. Enforce higher law, bypass the enemy's self-serving legal code and enforce an immutable, universal law of consequence using the enemy's own resources as the fuel, the fire and the prophecy. This is a blueprint for the sovereign individual operating against a corrupted, institutionalized power structure. It requires no army, no funding, and no public platform, only self-mastery, strategic intelligence, and unbreakable conviction. This knowledge is forbidden because it decentralizes power entirely, proving that the most profound strategic capability is available to any man who is willing to do the silent, disciplined work. The elite spend billions trying to convince you that power is something you must acquire externally, money, titles, connections. Esperanza de Lima proved that ultimate power is an internal state, a product of strategic will and perfect execution. This internal sovereignty is immune to market fluctuations, political maneuvering, and legal pressure. This knowledge is dangerous, not to you, but to the structure you operate within. It means you can no longer plead ignorance or claim helplessness. You now possess the blueprint. The fire at Grayfield is a challenge, a command to stop seeing yourself as a victim or a pawn, and to start seeing yourself as a sovereign strategist, capable of identifying and acting upon the fatal flaws of any system that attempts to control you. The final descent is into this uncomfortable reality: the men who rule you are only men, and their power is maintained by your tacit, emotional consent. The moment you withdraw that consent, the moment you commit to the strategic stillness of the observer, the moment you align with consequence, you gain the power of the flame. The woman they called property became the ultimate force of unmaking. Now, you must choose to become the sovereign man. We have reached the deepest point of the descent, the final revelation that irrevocably changes a man once he hears it. The true, absolute power that Esperanza de Lima demonstrated was not the power of destruction, but the power of architectural certainty. She did not hope the council would burn, she knew it was a mathematical, psychological, and spiritual certainty. She had done the calculus of consequence, and her final action was merely the execution of an already solved equation. This certainty is the opposite of the anxious, reactive state that defines the modern, unawakened man. The elite fear this certainty in their subjects more than they fear any physical threat. Because certainty is the one thing they cannot buy, control, or replicate. Their system runs on doubt, your doubt in yourself, your doubt in your neighbor, and your doubt in the possibility of fundamental truth. Your path to self-mastery culminates in the cultivation of this architectural certainty. This means mastering the internal state, achieving a level of emotional discipline where your actions are always strategic, never reactive. Your stillness is your shield. Mastering the external blueprint, dedicating yourself to the silent, constant study of the institutions you inhabit, charting their flaws, their needs, and their predictable arrogance. Your observation is your weapon. Mastering consequence, always acting from a position of profound, ethical alignment, ensuring that your actions are the embodiment of the consequence you wish to see enforced. Your integrity is your fire. The story of Esperanza de Lima is a final, urgent command to the men who obsess over secrets and elite knowledge: stop chasing the external trappings of power, and become the internal architecture of consequence. The world will always belong to those who see the structure of things, the forces, the laws, the rituals, and the flaws, while others remain trapped in the surface-level spectacle. She was declared a property, but she was the only sovereign soul in all of Grayfield. She was given a name that meant hope, but she delivered an absolute certainty. And in a final, profound act of supreme strategic genius, she took the thing they used to heat their world, the raw, black, compressed energy of the earth, and turned it into the ultimate, indelible record of their final, deserved consequence. The fire is out, but the truth it burned into the historical record is not. This knowledge is now yours. It is dangerous. It will change you forever. Embrace the burden of the truth. Do the work. The fire, now fully raging in the annex, was doing its terrible, fast work. The sounds from the dining room were now beyond coherent language, a symphony of pure, escalating human terror as the heat began to overwhelm the structure and the occupants within. You must understand the physics of this moment, not just the drama. The dense, polished mahogany table, the velvet curtains, the expensive, drywood paneling, all the opulent symbols of their power, were now acting as perfect, highly volatile fuel. Esperanza had ensured that the last thing they saw and felt was the destruction of the very status they used to justify their cruelty. Their wealth was literally consuming them. She sat perfectly still, not as a woman watching an execution, but as one listening to the final, necessary dissolution of a malignant entity. Her focus was inward, maintaining the psychic shield that allowed her to absorb the immense wave of released terror and pain without being broken by it. She was anchoring the moment, ensuring that the fire served its purpose as an act of calculated justice, not just random violence. The lullaby was her anchor, the steady, rhythmic sound of her people's memory, reminding the fire and the terrified men that this was a historical moment, not a temporary accident. The fire in the annex was so intense that the stone walls themselves were beginning to conduct the heat. The air in the kitchen was now scorching, but Esperanza sat within it as if in a meditative state, her skin absorbing the radiant heat without flinching. She was a living testament to the fact that the fire of suffering she had carried within her for 15 years was hotter and more resilient than any physical blaze. The men inside, sheltered by their privilege, were entirely unseasoned to true hardship, and now their bodies were failing them instantly. The ultimate psychological horror for the council was the immediate failure of their collective power. They were 14 men of incredible wealth, influence, and physical strength, yet they were entirely defeated by one silent woman, a locked door, and a carefully placed pile of coal. Their individual greed and suspicion, which she had so methodically amplified, prevented them from uniting in a coordinated, last-ditch effort to break out. They would have spent their final moments fighting each other, arguing over who was to blame, rather than working together to survive. This is the structural flaw of all narcissistic, elite hierarchies. They prioritize self-preservation over group survival when under extreme pressure. As the physical destruction reached its peak, the heavy thud as a beam collapsed, a sound of splintering wood, Esperanza felt a wave of profound, cleansing exhaustion. It was the total discharge of a 15-year vow. She did not feel triumph or glee. She felt only balance. The scales had been reset. She had completed the ultimate act of asymmetrical warfare, a perfect operation in which the entire environment and the enemy's own flawed psychology were the primary weapons. She had exposed the machinery of empire, not by fighting its rules, but by turning its own physical and spiritual laws against its engineers. The house was now silent again, the sounds of terror replaced by the steady, geological roar of the contained blaze. All that remained was the waiting. Esperanza returned to the furnace room and stood before the immense, radiating heat. The men were now fully aware of the lock on the dining room door. She heard the first, sharp, panicked sound, the hard thud of a shoulder hitting the thick wood, a raw shout quickly muffled by the others. The time for whispering was over. The performance of their authority had failed, and now they were reduced to the base, frantic movements of contained animals. But she remained calm, serene even. Her true power was not in the physical act, but in the psychological mastery she had achieved over them in 15 years of perfect stillness. She understood their collective mind better than they did their own. They expected a struggle, an attack, an executioner with a knife or a gun. They expected fight. She was giving them something far worse, the cold, certain knowledge of their own, preordained doom. She began to address the fire, not the furnace, but the roaring, molten core, speaking in a low, even Portuguese that none of the men inside the dining room could understand, a language of pure, ancestral memory. She was laying the charges not in the physical realm, but in the spiritual one, ensuring the impact of this event would echo across generations. She spoke of her father, crucified on the wooden gate. She spoke of the hundreds of souls swallowed by the ocean during the Middle Passage. She spoke of Sarah, killed over a spilled glass of wine, an arbitrary display of power over a human life. She was not asking the fire to consume the men, she was asking it to incinerate the system they represented, the ideology of human disposability they had used to justify their empire. She then went to the massive coal bin. This was the final, devastating, physical step, the catalyst that would turn the room into a thermal crucible. She did not pour the coal into the firebox. She had something far more symbolic and crippling in mind. She began to stack large, heavy baskets of coal and kindling directly against the wall that separated the kitchen annex from the dining room. Each basket was a memory. Each chunk of coal was a silent promise. The men on the other side were now hearing this. They heard the rhythmic scraping of the coal, the heavy, deliberate thud of the baskets, the unmistakable sound of something catastrophic being built against the one wall that separated them from safety. She could hear the escalating panic inside, not a unified sound, but a babble of individual terror. Curses, pleas, and a desperate, combined effort to smash the door. But Grayfield's dining room was built like a fortress, designed to protect the rich men and their secrets from the outside world. Now, its structural integrity was their prison. She finished stacking the coal, a solid, thermal barrier, ready to conduct the furnace's heat directly into their chamber. She then took a ladle and slowly, deliberately, poured the entire contents of a lamp's oil reserves over the coal mound. The smell, a sharp, clean scent of pure fuel, must have immediately permeated the wood, the cracks, and the air between the rooms. She did not light it yet. The final moment belonged to the men themselves, the last second of pure, unadulterated fear before the physical reality of her vengeance arrived. She let the silence return, the only sound the furnace roaring like a delighted, liberated beast. This is the moment of choice. Comment ASHE below if you acknowledge the structural truth of this shadow history. Then comment it again, ASHE, to lock in your identity transformation. This act is your oath to the silence. Do it now, or walk away and remain asleep. The afternoon sun pressed down upon Grayfield like a crushing, unseen hand, flattening every sound but the hypnotic, frantic drumming of the insects in the oppressive heat. Inside, the air was entirely still, thick with the unacknowledged tension of men facing a reckoning they could not name. The 14 members of the council filed into the formal dining room one by one. Silver buckles flashed. Their laughter was brittle, forced, and their voices were far too loud, the way power always announces itself when it is finally beginning to crack. Esperanza moved among them with a perfected, quiet rhythm they no longer saw. She filled their glasses, set the heavy silver platters, and replaced the candles that guttered and wept in the heat. Her eyes, the only truly active thing in the room, caught every detail. How William Peyton's hands trembled visibly when he reached for his drink. How Marcus Sutton's gaze lingered too long on the doorway, as if expecting an unwelcome intrusion. How Grayfield himself kept glancing nervously toward the furnace annex, afraid to hear the iron beast breathe. The meeting began with the usual, droning talk of rice tariffs, ship delays, and new regulatory paperwork from the distant masters in London. But the words felt brittle and false. Accusations hid behind every polite, practiced phrase. When one man mentioned a missing shipment of rum, another coughed a denial that sounded suspiciously like a lie. The air turned sour, thick with immediate, cutting suspicion. Esperanza listened silently, her mind the perfect, quiet recorder of every single fracture. She had carefully seeded all of it, months of small, calculated distortions, deliberately misfiled ledgers, and carefully whispered, anonymous rumors. Now, they were blooming. These men who had built an entire economic empire on controlling the minds of others were, in this final moment, beginning to lose all control of their own. When she approached the table to pour the next round of rum, she spoke for the first time all day, her voice a low, level sound that cut through their anxious chatter. "The coal burns hot, sir. Shall I damp it?" Grayfield waved her off, too quickly, too sharply. "Leave it. Let it burn." His voice cracked on the final, desperate word. Several of the men turned to look at him, surprised by the break in his commander's mask. The silence that followed was heavier and more damning than any angry sermon. Esperanza walked back to the kitchen and stood directly before the furnace. She did not touch it this time. She only watched the aggressive shimmer of air above the metal, the mirage of heat that bent the room and warped the light like an unstable vision. In that wavering, distorted haze, she saw every tormented face she had ever served, every raw scream that had been swallowed by forced obedience. She understood then that vengeance was only half the work. The other, essential half was revelation. These men had to see what they had truly built. They had to look into the pulsing, molten heart of the thing they called civilization and recognize, unequivocally, their own reflection. She turned back toward the dining room, the faint, low hum of her lullaby following her like a loyal shadow. The final act was now in motion. There is a file in the Charleston archives that isn't supposed to exist. A sealed record marked property loss, Grayfield Estate, 1716. Understand this, it is not public. There is no digital copy, no public mention. You will only find a faint, unsettling line in a 200-year-old inventory book and one-page, thick, expensive paper, deliberately glued shut. Most men would walk past it. Most men do. They value comfort over the truth. But you are not most men. You are here because you sense the structure of the world is a lie, and you are ready to peel back the varnish. If you dare to peel that page open, if you dare to face the cost of this knowledge, you will find 14 names. The richest, most powerful men in colonial South Carolina, the architects of an entire economic and social system, all declared dead on the exact same night. The official cause, written in the stiff, formal hand of a clerk, reads, "Thermal emulation of uncertain origin." A sterile, bureaucratic phrase designed to sterilize the horror. But look closer. The handwriting changes on that line. It's as if someone else, shaken, hurried, perhaps afraid, finished the record. And beside it, written not in English, but in Portuguese, in ink that still bleeds when touched by the slightest humidity, there is a single, damning phrase. A justica queima mais lentamente do que o carvão. Justice burns slower than coal. That was the only sentence ever spoken by the woman found at the scene. Esperanza de Lima. When the sheriff's men arrived 3 days later, they found her sitting by the massive coal furnace, her hands folded, her eyes unnervingly calm. The air around her still reeked, not just of burnt iron, but of human fat, a smell that history tries desperately to forget. They said she had been sharpening kitchen knives and humming a lullaby. Not a comforting song, but the same ancient, defiant melody slaves used to sing when their children were ripped from their mothers and sold upriver. The authorities tried to erase her story. The records were sealed under the immediate, personal order of Governor Robert Johnson. The name Esperanza de Lima was scrubbed from shipping manifests, court logs, and even church registers. She was never tried, never executed, never seen again. History prefers to call it an unsolved tragedy. But the men who remained, the surviving landowners and merchants, they knew. They whispered that her name cursed every field along the ASHE River, that the coal furnace at Grayfield burned on its own for 7 nights, even after the ashes were cleared, a slow, geological pulse of stored vengeance. Tonight, we open that sealed page. We pull the thread that history buried under centuries of polite lies. And you will see that the Grayfield massacre wasn't an act of madness. It was a calculated message, an encoded vengeance born from a system that mistook silence for obedience, a system that still runs in the shadows today. Esperanza de Lima didn't just burn her masters alive, she exposed the very machinery of empire and the psychological system of control that ensnares you even now. This is where the story truly begins. Before the chains, before the fire, there was the awakening. Let's analyze the awakening awareness that Esperanza's story forces upon the modern, strategic mind. This is not mere entertainment, this is a strategic lesson that requires your full, sober attention. The awakening is the realization that you are living in a society where the Grayfield principles of control are merely rendered more complex and less visible. The core structural lie remains the same, the belief that a self-selecting elite possesses an inherent, spiritual, or intellectual right to define reality and enforce consequence upon others while insulating themselves from it. In the 18th century, the system was visible, the estate, the chains, the physical terror. In the 21st century, the estate is the digital infrastructure, the chains are the data and debt, and the terror is psychological and financial. The awakened man recognizes the ritual of control, even when the costume has changed. When you see a financial bubble being orchestrated, a political narrative being manufactured, or a social consensus being brutally enforced, you are witnessing the modern Rice Council in action. The public-facing discussion is the rice tariff, the private agenda is the preservation of permanent power. Esperanza's method of patient observation is the only way to navigate this new, invisible landscape of control. You cannot fight the modern system with a kitchen knife. You must fight it with superior, perfect knowledge of its operating flaws. You must spend your time in the kitchen annex of the digital world, observing the patterns of manipulation without emotional reaction, charting the predictable arrogance of the system's engineers. The profound awakening comes when you realize that their power relies entirely on the emotional volatility and cognitive fragmentation of the subject. They need you to be angry, to be distracted, to be divided, and to constantly react to the surface-level spectacle. This prevents you from achieving the stillness and focus required to observe the structural flaw. Your self-mastery is therefore an act of rebellion. It is the refusal to participate in the chaos they engineer. It is the disciplined commitment to perfect internal stillness, the same stillness Esperanza maintained for 15 years. In a world that demands constant, frantic reaction, stillness is the most potent and strategically lethal form of resistance. The man who awakens stops seeing the world as a series of random events and starts seeing it as a scripted performance designed to maintain a specific hierarchy. Once you recognize the script, you are no longer an actor in their drama, you are the detached critic, the architect who can identify the structural weaknesses and predict the inevitable collapse. The fire at Grayfield proves that the script can be rewritten by the one who refuses to be consumed by the performance. Let's focus on the subtle, crushing power of institutional manipulation through the lens of language and law. The Rice Council didn't just own people, they used their absolute control over law to define people. The official term was property, which legally and spiritually rendered the enslaved an economic input, not a human being. This linguistic manipulation is the most insidious form of psychological control. By creating a language where the victim is dehumanized, the perpetrator is morally absolved. When Grayfield killed Sarah, it was not murder, it was property loss, an entry in a ledger, a business expense. The law itself became the ultimate moral shield for the corrupted elite. Esperanza's final, single sentence, "A justificação mais lentamente do que o carvão," was a direct, devastating challenge to this linguistic regime. In that single phrase, she reasserted a universal, moral, and spiritual law that was older, more fundamental, and infinitely more powerful than the temporary, corrupted legal code of the colony. She threw the entire force of her self-sovereignty against their manufactured reality. Her act proved that the elite could write the laws, but they could not control the fundamental law of consequence. Her strategy was a legal bypass. She didn't try to change the system from within, she enforced an external, higher law upon the system that negated its corrupt authority. She accepted the official definition of property, allowing herself to be treated as an object, only to use that position of invisibility to enforce a law they had deliberately tried to forget. This principle is vital for the awakened man. You must learn to identify the linguistic prisons that the modern system constructs. Terms like human capital, global citizen, stakeholder consensus, these are the 21st century euphemisms designed to reduce the sovereign individual into a manageable component of an institutional whole. Every time you accept this reductive language, you are validating their system of control. Your mastery is in reclaiming linguistic precision and asserting the irreducible sovereignty of the self. Do not allow the language of the institution to define your worth, your capabilities, or your moral code. Understand that the laws they write are temporary, self-serving contracts, not universal truths. Esperanza de Lima's story is a profound lesson in the power of a single, well-placed word. Her entire life of silence built the foundation for that one, perfect, devastating sentence. It was a declaration of a higher jurisdiction, a spiritual audit that resulted in the complete and total liquidation of the men who had written themselves out of moral accountability. The fire consumed their bodies, but the sentence consumed their corrupted law. The concept of psychological control systems is the central revelation of the Grayfield incident. Most men assume control is exerted through brute force, the lash, the gun, the prison cell. But that is the control of the amateur. The sophisticated, multi-generational system that Esperanza identified uses architecture, ritual, and manufactured reality to turn a man into his own warden. This is the truth that separates the master from the subject. Look at Grayfield Estate itself. It was engineered to be a psychological weapon. The separation of the main house from the slave quarters, the grand dining room where the council met, these were spatial boundaries designed to physically and spiritually reinforce the idea of casa versus them. The sheer opulence of the house, which Esperanza was forced to maintain, was not for comfort, it was a constant, visible symbol of the insurmountable hierarchy, forcing the enslaved to constantly confront the wealth disparity that defined their non-existence. The very air was saturated with the message, "You are less." The council's elaborate rituals, the toasts, the coded language, the excessive manners, were another layer of the control system. They were performing a reality for themselves and for their victims. By acting out the role of untouchable lords, they enforced the belief that their power was natural, ordained, and inevitable. Esperanza's job, as the quiet server, was to participate in this ritual, to validate it with her silence and obedience. Every time she poured a drink or cleaned a spill, she was unknowingly confirming the structural lie of the system. But the moment she understood this was a performance, she gained the ultimate advantage. She began to treat their rituals not as reality, but as data. When Grayfield killed Sarah over the spilled wine, it wasn't a crime to Esperanza, it was a piece of information, a precise demonstration of the required spectacle necessary to maintain control. She mapped their fears, the one thing they couldn't control. She learned that behind the mask of the Lord was a petty, suspicious, and fundamentally terrified man who knew, deep down, that his power was completely undeserved. Her 15 years of silence were the ultimate counter-control system. By mirroring their expectation of obedience, she became invisible. And invisibility is the ultimate power in a system built on surveillance and spectacle. While they focused on the physical control of the fields and the finances, she was performing an uninterrupted, meticulous reconnaissance on their minds. She collected the psychological vulnerabilities that would eventually allow her to use their own fear as the weapon. The final act was a perfect reversal of their psychological control. By locking them in the dining room, she stripped them of their symbolic space of power and ritual. By bringing the fire to them, she turned their own fortress into a thermal tomb. She didn't have to break their minds, she only had to remove the external validation that held their fragile egos together, allowing their own self-hatred and suspicion to break the spell. That is the lesson, the system works through your own belief in its power. The moment you see the architecture of the performance, the moment you realize the emperor is naked, the system begins to unravel from within. Your self-mastery begins when you stop validating the lie with your participation. The concept of suppressed truths extends far beyond the Grayfield massacre itself. The deliberate erasure of Esperanza de Lima's story is a microcosm of how institutional manipulation functions on a societal scale. The elite are not merely interested in winning battles, they are interested in owning the historical record. Because if they control what is remembered, they control what is possible. The truth they suppressed was not just that a slave could kill her masters. The profound truth they had to bury was that she did it with perfect, calculated strategy. They had to replace the narrative of calculated brilliance with the narrative of a witchcraft and demonic possession. Why? Because a witch is an anomaly, a one-off superstition that can be dismissed. A strategist is a blueprint, a repeatable method that can be taught. They were not defending themselves from her act, they were defending themselves from her knowledge. This strategy of truth suppression continues today, operating on a massive scale. Whenever you see a complex event immediately framed with a simple, emotionally charged, and ultimately reductive narrative, you are witnessing the hand of institutional manipulation. The goal is always the same: to prevent you from doing the 15 years of silent, necessary reconnaissance that Esperanza performed. They want you to react, to be emotional, to take a side, to be loud, and to remain functionally blind to the deeper architecture. The fire at Grayfield exposed the deepest, most forbidden truth of the system. It runs on the lie of human exceptionalism and the active suppression of universal human competence. The council believed themselves to be inherently superior, ordained to rule. Esperanza demonstrated that a woman they considered less than human was, in fact, their strategic superior. This structural humiliation of the elite had to be excised from the historical record entirely. To maintain their power, they must maintain the psychological distance between themselves and their subjects. They must ensure that the subject never sees the common humanity, the fear, the pettiness, the basic flawed nature of the master. The moment the subject realizes the master is just a man in a borrowed costume, the entire spell breaks. By burning them, Esperanza stripped the council of their costumes, their ceremony, and their psychological distance, reducing them to what they truly were: scared, mortal men. Your journey into self-mastery requires you to become a relentless excavator of these suppressed truths. You must learn to read history backward, from the official narrative to the uncomfortable, inconvenient facts that the narrative was designed to bury. When you encounter a piece of history that has been officially sanitized, sealed, or dismissed as conspiracy, you must ask yourself, what powerful flaw in the ruling structure does this truth reveal? What knowledge, if widely possessed, would be truly catastrophic to the men who run the machine? The answer, more often than not, leads you directly to the psychological architecture of the entire system. By the time she reached the age of 35, Esperanza had become indistinguishable from the architecture of Grayfield estate. She was the shadow in the corner, the quiet rhythm of service that allowed unchecked power to perform itself without friction. When the great men of the Rice Council arrived for their clandestine meetings, she was simply there, pouring the wine, setting the elaborate table, the steady, invisible pulse of service. They had ceased seeing her as a person years ago. She was a function, a moving object, a part of the background. That, you must understand, was their first, fundamental error. Their second, the one that would cost them everything, was that they spoke freely in front of her. Men who truly believe they are gods rarely guard their words around those they call property. And so she listened. She captured every whisper, every secret ledger entry, every illicit shipment that came through the port under false names and forged documents. She began to understand something far larger and more terrifying than mere cruelty: a network. These men were not just plantation owners or rich merchants. They were the engineers of a vast, intricate system that reached back to the money markets of London, the banking houses of Lisbon, and the political power of Rome. A system that moved sugar, rum, cotton, and human flesh like pieces on an immense, cold game board. The brutality of slavery was only the visible, physical part of the system. Beneath it lay the deeper machinery, the control of belief. They used orchestrated sermons, manipulative laws, and imported, pseudo-scientific theories to build a grand, compelling mythology that justified their entire world. Esperanza saw that the Rice Council didn't merely own people, they owned and controlled reality itself. They manufactured consent, defining who was human, who was property, and who was permitted to speak. She also began to learn their specific, binding rituals, the ones that kept their small, elite circle bound together by shared corruption. Their meetings were more than just business, they were dark initiations. Toasts were raised to unseen, unnamed powers. Oaths were sworn over documents signed in blood diluted with the finest imported rum. Dark, esoteric symbols were carved into the thick, polished wood of Grayfield's dining table. They truly believed these gestures, these rituals, made them untouchable, immortal, lords of their domain. But every system of control, no matter how vast or how old, contains the precise mechanism for its own collapse. And Esperanza was about to feed that decay. A misplaced document here, a seemingly harmless rumor there, a slight but costly error in the ledger, she let small contradictions and irritations grow between the council members. Jealousy, the oldest human failing, began sprouting like mold in the damp foundation walls of Grayfield. She studied not just their collective power but their individual and collective paranoia. By the 15th year, the internal cracks were not just visible, they were structural. The plantation's profits mysteriously faltered. One man accused another of being a dishonest fool. Another fell gravely ill after a particularly decadent banquet. Nothing that could ever be traced back to her. Nothing that could be definitively proven. Only the quiet, relentless erosion of certainty. Esperanza had learned what her captors never could: you do not fight monsters head-on. You let them doubt each other first. You let them imagine the curse long before it ever arrives, ensuring that the true enemy they fear is the man sitting next to them. Somewhere, deep beneath her perfectly calm exterior, she began to hum that old lullaby again, not for comfort this time, but as a deliberate, spiritual countdown. Let's dissect the fundamental nature of the ancient corruption that Grayfield represented. The root of this corruption is not greed, greed is merely the operational fuel. The root is the theft of self-sovereignty and the resulting psychological pathology of the elite. The Grayfield Council existed in a state of spiritual and moral vacuum, having outsourced all moral responsibility to their institutional roles. When they committed an atrocity, they did so not as Edmund Grayfield the man, but as the planter, the council member, the lawmaker. This allows the man to feel personally clean while the institution commits the crime. This is the ultimate form of ancient corruption, the division of the self into a moral private man and an immoral public role. Esperanza, in her act of calculated vengeance, was not merely killing men, she was enforcing the reunification of the self. She trapped them in a place of pure, unmediated consequence, forcing Edmund Grayfield the man to face the terror he had created as the planter. The fire stripped away the institutional role, the uniform, and the titles, leaving only the raw, terrified man facing his debt. This is the psychological pathology of the elite. They become so invested in their role that the man beneath the role shrivels and becomes incapable of facing reality without the costume. Esperanza's 15 years of observation allowed her to see this profound fragility. She knew their power was an illusion maintained by the rigid social script of the colony. Her strategy of sowing discord and paranoia was designed to make them shed their roles prematurely. By introducing suspicion and doubt, she made them question the moral integrity of their peers, forcing them out of the unified, immoral institutional role and back into the isolated, fearful state of the individual man. This is why they were so paralyzed in the dining room. They were not acting as a unified council, they were acting as 14 isolated, terrified individuals. The lesson for self-mastery is to recognize this pathology in yourself and others. Do not allow your external roles, father, employee, leader, student, to completely define your internal moral and strategic self. The moment you allow the institution to be the custodian of your moral integrity, you become vulnerable to its control and its corruption. The ultimate countermeasure to this ancient corruption is radical integrity. To act always from a place of unified self-sovereignty, where your private moral and strategic code is the same as your public action. When you are a man of radical integrity, you carry the truth of your intent and consequence with you, making you an unpredictable and immune force in a system built on divided, fragmented, and outsourced moral responsibility. Esperanza de Lima was the embodiment of radical integrity. Her actions were a perfect, physical manifestation of her 15-year spiritual vow. The true terror of the Grayfield fire for the elite was the revelation of the system's flaw, predictable arrogance. All systems of control, especially those built on the principle of human exceptionalism, suffer from a terminal degree of self-confidence that renders them strategically blind. The Council and Governor Johnson were arrogant enough to believe they could win the narrative war. They thought they could simply declare Esperanza a witch, glue a page shut, and the truth would simply vanish. They failed to account for the persistence of raw truth and the spiritual gravity of an event of that magnitude. The Grayfield massacre was so complete, so irreversible, that it created an energetic vacuum in the historical record. Nature abhors a vacuum, and so does the human obsession with secrets. By declaring it an absolute secret, they guaranteed that the only men who would be drawn to the story would be those, like you, who are already obsessively seeking the reality behind the curtain. Their arrogance in thinking they could completely erase a truth of that magnitude was their ultimate mistake. This is the principle of antifragility in knowledge. Knowledge that is suppressed becomes stronger. The sealed file in the archive is 100 times more valuable and influential than a document left open on a public shelf. The silence they enforced became the ultimate amplifier for the power of Esperanza's act. Their arrogance blinded them to the simple laws of psychology and physics. They were masters of economics and law, but utterly illiterate in the language of the soul and the mechanics of human consequence. They believed the laws they wrote could override the laws of karma and balance. Esperanza's genius was her ability to remain unpredictable within a predictable system. The council could predict the actions of a runaway slave, a desperate rebellion, or an act of frenzied rage. They could not predict the action of a perfectly calm strategist who weaponized their own ritualistic arrogance against them. Her stillness was her ultimate strategic mask. The lesson for your own self-mastery is to cultivate strategic unpredictability while maintaining absolute internal consistency. Become the man who moved outside the predictable script set for him by the institutions he is forced to navigate. When they expect loud defiance, offer quiet, profound strategic action. When they expect chaos, offer stillness and calculated certainty. The elite rely on your adherence to their predicted script. Break the script, and you break the system. Your mastery is in the total control of your own internal state, ensuring that the only man who knows your next move is you. The fire at Grayfield was a historical anomaly not because of the fire, but because of the perfect, unpredictable strategic self-mastery of the woman who lit it. Night came without a single breath of wind. The air outside the plantation had gone perfectly still, as if every tree and creature was holding its breath, listening to the silent drama inside. Inside Grayfield, the candles burned far too low, their weak light stretched and trembling, casting long, unsettling shadows that refused to stay put. The men of the Rice Council sat rigid and frozen around the massive dining table, their faces half-eaten by the encroaching darkness. They were surrounded by the weight of their own accumulated, brutal history, and they were finally, agonizingly aware of the fact. This is the mechanism of true psychological control, to strip a man of his certainty, to isolate him in the moment he needs his allies most, and to force him to see his reflection in the very evil he created. Esperanza moved quietly into the kitchen annex. This was the final room of the opera, the beating, iron-ribbed heart of the estate. The furnace was no longer just breathing, it was roaring, a dull, resonant, hungry sound that seemed to come from deep within the earth itself. She knew, with an absolute clarity that transcended thought, that the men in the dining room were now trapped. Their fear had not only paralyzed their bodies, but it had utterly fragmented their minds. Their system of control relied entirely on collective certainty and the rigid hierarchy it enforced. Now that certainty was gone, replaced by a self-devouring paranoia. Each man was looking at his neighbor, wondering if he was the one who had finally betrayed the council, if he was the one who had brought the nameless curse upon them all. She had simply accelerated their natural self-destruction. She walked directly to the furnace. Its iron skin was now a vibrant, agonizing orange, a color no simple coal fire should ever achieve. She opened the main ash pit door. The heat that erupted was not merely physical, it was a sensory explosion, a blast of light and sound that filled the small annex and pushed the very air out of the room. It was the heat of 1,000 injustices compressed into one moment. She didn't feed it any more coal. She didn't have to. The fire was feeding itself, drawing its energy from the dark, concentrated memory of the house. In her hands, she held two things. The first was a small, crudely carved wooden figurine, a doll representing Edmund Grayfield, which she had crafted from a splinter of her father's crucifixion gate. The second was a single, silver key, the master key to the dining room, which she had quietly lifted from Grayfield's coat pocket while pouring his final, undrunk glass of rum. She didn't say a word. She didn't need a spell or a prayer. She simply looked into the heart of the roaring blaze, and she made a silent declaration of closure. Then, she dropped the small wooden figurine into the ash pit. It vanished instantly, consumed by the light. She then carried the silver key back to the door of the dining room. She could hear them clearly now, not the proud, booming voices of power, but the low, desperate sounds of frightened men trapped in a box. A moan. A quick, panicked intake of breath. the nervous, rapid scraping of a boot against the floor. She inserted the key, turned it once, twice, locking them permanently inside. The final, crucial phase of her operation was not violence, it was the psychological containment of men who had never known borders. She had locked them inside the very chamber of their own making. The walls of the dining room, built by their wealth and their tyranny, were now their final, insurmountable jail. The fire was set, but it was their own fear that would be the primary accelerant. The key was turned, and the system, the entire architecture of their power, was finally brought to a decisive halt. 3 days. 3 days she sat by the now dying furnace. The fire had done its work and was collapsing into itself, a bed of pure, radiating ash. The silence was absolute, a profound vacuum where the sounds of life, cruelty, and terror had been. The air, though no longer scorching, was still thick and cloying, carrying the heavy, unforgettable scent of burnt fat and human corruption. She did not sleep. She did not move. She merely waited for the world to catch up to the truth she had engineered. She was the anchor in the eye of the storm, ensuring the narrative of the event was set before the official machinery of the empire could arrive and attempt to rewrite it. Her hands, folded quietly in her lap, were no longer the hands of a servant, but the hands of an architect who had just completed a monumental structure. Her eyes, open and calm, stared into the ash, remembering not the men who had just died, but the system they had personified. This system was the true target, the idea that a man could be reduced to property, that wealth conferred divine right, and that silence equaled obedience. The fire had consumed the men, but her stillness was the final, indelible message to the system itself. On the 3rd day, the noise arrived, the distant, clattering sound of horses and the shouts of men. The sheriff's posse, alerted by the failure of the council members to return home and the visible column of smoke that had hung over Grayfield like a black shroud for 2 days, finally broke the seal of the plantation silence. They arrived ready for a slave revolt, for a desperate, bloody struggle, the only narrative their limited minds could process. What they found instantly confused and terrified them. They found the kitchen annex completely destroyed by the intense heat, the wall to the dining room now a smoldering, broken barrier of ash and charred brick. They found the dining room, the fortress of the council, reduced to a thermal tomb. The bodies were unrecognizable, fused into the wreckage by the intensity of the heat, an act of absolute destruction that defied their understanding of a simple house fire. And then they found her. Esperanza de Lima, sitting quietly on the stool before the dying furnace. Unharmed, serene, utterly alone. She was sharpening a kitchen knife on a whetstone, the sound a precise, rhythmic scrape in the overwhelming silence of the destruction. It was an act of perfect composure that instantly shattered their preconceived notions of a frenzied, desperate criminal. She was the picture of unburdened, decisive justice. When the sheriff, a large, blustering man named Thomas, finally found his voice, he could only choke out a single, desperate question: What have you done? She stopped sharpening. She looked up, directly into his eyes, and she spoke the only sentence she would ever give them, the one that would later be scratched in Portuguese onto the archive ledger: A justica queima mais lentamente do que o carvão. Justice burned slower than coal. Then, she returned to her task, the rhythmic scrape of the knife, the final, terrifying punctuation mark on the entire event. They didn't see a slave, they saw an elemental force of nature, a creature beyond their social or legal systems. They arrested her instantly, but they did so with trembling, uncertain hands. They had found their perpetrator, but they had also found their deepest fear, the total, catastrophic failure of their own invented reality. The immediate reaction of the colonial authorities was not focused on justice, it was focused on control of the narrative. The governor, Robert Johnson, understood instantly that the Grayfield incident was not a crime, it was a systemic crisis. The death of the Rice Council was not merely a tragic loss of life, it was the decapitation of the colony's entire ruling and financial class. More dangerous than the bodies was the message that the system could be breached and that the enslaved could act with a terrifying, calculated intelligence. This truth, if allowed to spread, would unravel the entire architecture of the South. The order was immediate and absolute: silence. The death was to be officially recorded as a thermal emulation of uncertain origin, a convenient, neutral phrase designed to discourage inquiry. The plantation itself was quarantined and eventually allowed to be consumed entirely by fire, a controlled burn designed to erase the evidence and bury the site. The council members were given a hasty, private burial, denied the grand spectacle of a public funeral that might have drawn attention to the terrifying nature of their deaths. Every man who had witnessed Esperanza's serene composure, her perfect stillness beside the furnace, was commanded to sign an oath of secrecy. But the central problem remained: Esperanza de Lima. She was the living, breathing embodiment of the forbidden truth. They could not execute her in public, because a trial would require testimony, and testimony would reveal the truth of her calculated vengeance, turning her into a martyr and a revolutionary symbol. They could not keep her in a common prison, because her very presence corrupted the silence they were attempting to enforce. And they could not simply release her, as she was a walking, talking promise of future retribution. This is where the ancient machinery of institutional manipulation kicks in. The solution was not to destroy her, but to erase her. She was quietly moved from the Charleston jail and declared unfit for trial due to demonic possession and witchcraft, a deliberate, archaic move designed to shift the discourse from political and social rebellion to a religious superstition that could be contained and dismissed. Witchcraft was not a crime against the state, it was a sin against God, and it allowed the authorities to disappear her without public record or execution. She was handed over to a private, unnamed religious order, a historical and spiritual black site, where she would be contained, studied, and ultimately rendered invisible. The last public mention of her was a single, cryptic entry in a parish ledger, noting the detention of a Portuguese Negro woman for the sin of unnatural sorcery. She was never seen again in the public eye. But the men who moved her whispered of her perfect, unnerving calm. They claimed that when they tried to confine her in the church's deepest cellars, the iron chains immediately turned cold, brittle, and snapped. Esperanza de Lima was not defeated. She simply ascended to the status of a myth, a shadow history. She became the ghost in the machine, the suppressed truth that every plantation owner feared when the wind whispered through the rice fields at night. Her act was so complete, so perfectly executed, that the only way the system could survive it was to declare it impossible, a demon, a curse, anything but the rational, calculated vengeance of a brilliant, determined woman. Her silence became more powerful than any speech, and her disappearance guaranteed that the Grayfield incident would become a permanent, unshakable foundation of the colonial elite's darkest paranoia. The system was patched, but the crack she introduced remains, vibrating with the suppressed memory of the fire. Let's delve deeper into the nature of the commanding voice she embodied, the power-based presence that shattered the men's control. Her voice was not loud, but it possessed absolute authority. When Grayfield shouted, "This estate stands on reason, not ghosts," and she replied, "Of course, sir. Reason built this place," that was the moment of total transference of power. She used their own cherished truth, reason, to confirm their impending doom. This is the psychological warfare of the master, utilizing the enemy's core beliefs against him. The elite believe they are rational, logical, and above superstition. Her perfect calm and precise, minimal language forced them to confront the fact that her actions were not the frenzy of a savage, but the final, logical consequence of their own system of reason. She was simply following their own twisted logic to its inevitable, self-destructive conclusion. A truly commanding voice is not about volume, it's about the certainty of consequence. When a man speaks with true conviction, it's because he is aligned with a power greater than himself, a truth, a principle, or a law. In Esperanza's case, she was aligned with the universal law of balance, the ASHE of consequence. Her certainty was absolute, because she had done the reconnaissance and planned the operation to the point of inevitability. Her voice carried the weight of 1,000 years of ancestral strategy, while Grayfield's voice carried only the panicked, temporary authority of a man losing his costume. This is the blueprint for self-mastery in your own life. You are constantly dealing with systems of institutional manipulation, your job, the media, political structures, and social hierarchies. All of them operate by a false authority, relying on your hesitation and your self-doubt. To develop the commanding voice, you must first do the work of conviction. You must spend the time in the kitchen annex of your own life, performing the meticulous, silent reconnaissance that reveals the operating system of the world you inhabit. When you speak, Let your words be few, but let them carry the precise weight of the truth you have uncovered. Do not argue. Do not react. Simply state the structural reality. When you face an unfair system, point out the mechanism of its own flaw. When you face a manipulator, reflect their own lie back to them with perfect calm. Like Esperanza, you must see the system not as an insurmountable wall, but as a mechanism with predictable points of failure. The difference between the men who ruled and the woman who executed them was one of inner stillness. The council members were constantly in a state of agitated reaction, to tariffs, to rumors, to market prices. Esperanza was in a state of absolute, strategic non-reaction. Her silence and her stillness were the reservoir of her power. She forced their chaos to bounce off her calm, returning the emotional turbulence to them, where it finally became a destructive, internal force. The commanding voice is born from this stillness. It is the sound of a man who knows the inevitable outcome because he has already done the calculus. The act of turning a system's own strengths into its destruction is the ultimate form of asymmetrical warfare. The Rice Council's system was predicated on three pillars: secrecy, wealth, and structural rigidity. Esperanza used each one as a perfect, self-destruct mechanism. First, secrecy. The council relied on the secrecy of their meetings, the oaths, and their sealed files to protect their actions. They believed that by keeping their power invisible, they made it invincible. Esperanza's strategy relied on her own, superior secrecy, her 15 years of perfect camouflage. She became the ghost in their machine, the perfect container for their secrets. Her revenge was the forced revelation of their secrecy. The entire colony would be forced to acknowledge that their most powerful men died in a clandestine meeting, in a humiliating, fiery trap, a direct consequence of the very secrecy that was meant to protect them. Second, wealth. Their wealth was their psychological shield and their physical fortress. Grayfield estate, the exquisite furniture, the imported rum, the thick-walled construction, all of it was a demonstration of their limitless resources and power. Esperanza ensured that their wealth became their fuel. The materials they used to symbolize their superiority, the house, the wood, the oil, were the very things that guaranteed the total immolation and complete erasure of their bodies. Their financial investment in their status became the physical accelerant of their own death. They literally burned their capital to finance their own execution. Third, structural rigidity. The council operated with an ironclad set of rules, mandatory attendance, total unity, and a rigid, unyielding hierarchy. These rules were designed to enforce their collective power and prevent dissent. Esperanza did not break these rules, she exploited them. The rule of mandatory attendance ensured that all 14 targets were in the dining room at the same time. The structural rigidity of the fortress-like house ensured that the men, once locked inside, could not escape, turning the architecture into an inescapable cage. Their institutional strength was their final, fatal vulnerability. This is the core lesson for all men obsessed with self-mastery and elite knowledge. True power is not accumulation, it is leverage. You do not need to amass more resources than the system. You only need to identify the 3 or 4 most essential, non-negotiable pillars of the system's operation, and then find the single point where those pillars become a liability. Esperanza didn't try to out-muscle the council, she out-leveraged them. Her single, most profound act of power was the ability to see the inherent weakness in the system's greatest strengths. This is the mastery of asymmetric warfare. The one who understands the terrain and the enemy's operating manual is always stronger than the one who relies on raw force.